Anomalies. Anomalies.
Anomalies.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what lurks in those shadows. This is a program about the unexplained and the unexplainable.
Hey Dave, welcome to another episode of Anomalies. What is this episode anyway? About 40 or are we up to that?
Hey Dan, I think it's number 38, so we're
Close.
picking up steam here in our old age.
Well, I'm getting older by the minute. I'm really looking forward to our guest tonight, not only because of the topics that we're going to discuss, is that our guest, Greg Little, is kind of responsible for having me be employed in a past life with the Idaho Department of Corrections. He did some work in a cognitive behavioral change arena, and I was certified in that work, which is called moral recognition therapy. And it's kind of weird that we have this connection later on. But tonight we're not going to be talking about MRT. We're going to be talking about Edgar Cayce and Atlantis, which are two very interesting topics in my book. So let's welcome Greg to the show. Greg, thanks for being on with us.
Hey guys, thanks a lot. Appreciate it, and we'll see where this goes. But it's always a pleasure to do these. Keeps me sort of straight and in tune with things and practiced. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you.
Yes.
So kind of take us from what I just talked about, which is somebody who worked in the cognitive behavioral change area of psychology, to talking about Edgar Cayce and Atlantis. How'd you get there?
Well, man, that's an interesting transition to try to deal with. Excuse me. I guess I can go back kind of a long way. One of the things that I've been asked before that I sometimes talk about was how I got involved in everything that I'm into. And the best I can tell you is back in the 1960s, shortly after John Kennedy was assassinated, my family picked up and moved from Hughesville, Pennsylvania to Huntsville, Alabama. And my father went to work at Redstone Arsenal, working on the Mercury and then Gemini space program. And somewhere in that time, I was 10, 11, 12 years old then, I got interested in UFOs. I remember reading some things about Atlantis, but I really didn't have any interest in it at all. But I had an interest in archaeology, obviously an interest in psychology. When I went to college, of course, I majored in psychology, and then in graduate school, I got into experimental psychology, but a specific area called psychopharmacology, which is the study of how drugs work at the cellular and molecular level in the brain. And that was going to be my area. My major professor at the time had an interest in New Age things and in things like back in the 70s, it was believed that if you put a razor blade inside of a pyramid of some kind, that it would sharpen the blade and it would keep it from rusting and all that. We did experiments like that. We also did experiments with plants where we would hook plants up to a 8 to 12 channel electroencephalograph, and we would do experiments with the plants to see if the plants had feelings. It's a weird way to put it, or if they could identify a person who had come in earlier and torn a leaf off of them, because that was one of the things everybody was talking about then. But that was kind of the heyday of the New Age, and Edgar Cayce, of course, was around then. I got interested in Cayce mainly because he had an early life experience with an angel at age 13 that changed his life. That's got to be very similar to Joan of Arc, who had an early life experience with an angel that changed her life. There's also many others that I could go through that had similar accounts. But Cayce's was really interesting to me because Cayce had a lot of research done by professionals who were interested in what were then called his health readings. Edgar Cayce was a psychic. He was sort of a psychic diagnostician who would diagnose people's problems after going into a trance And then if it was possible, he would recommend some sort of remedy or some sort of treatment regimen that might help the person. There are 14,000 of those readings that were written down, and they followed up and to see if these readings actually helped people, health readings. Now, Cayce was born in 1877, so it's not long after the Civil War. There wasn't a great deal, and medicine hadn't really come that far in the 1870s and 1880s. So most of Cayce's remedies are common sense. Some of them are just absolutely bizarre, but they work. Some of the stories about Cayce are absolutely bizarre, but they're all documented. So if there is such a thing as a true psychic who's lived, Edgar Cayce fits that bill. But my interest in Cayce was only because of UFOs. In graduate school, I got very interested in the UFO phenomenon, particularly abductions, alien abduction stories. Not the ones where people would say a tall Nordic woman walked out of a flying saucer and they had sex with her or something. That wasn't the tales that got me. But I was interested in abductions. I actually started interviewing people. I did quite a bit of research in that. And my first book was called The Archetype Experience. It came out in 1984. And it was a follow-up to Carl Jung's book on flying saucers. So that's kind of how I got into this. All this time, I'm talking about all this kind of paranormal, new agey sort of stuff. I had my other feet. I must have more than two, but my feet were firmly planted in science and research. I was publishing loads of articles. I have a couple hundred articles published over the years in peer-reviewed journals in psychology and criminal justice and corrections and community issues and social work and all that kind of stuff. So I've maintained a real scientific interest in this. I wrote a textbook in psychopharmacology that was used in a lot of universities. Unfortunately, those books get out of date way too fast because things are happening so quickly. You have to update the book every couple of years for it to be used. But it was great. I wrote a book on obesity along with a physician. There were loads of others that I did in topics like that. So I've tried to keep both feet firmly planted in science. A few years ago, which isn't a few anymore, I'd say 20 years ago to 21 years ago, my wife were members of the Edgar Cayce organization, which is called the ARE, the Association for Research and Enlightenment. It's headquartered in Virginia Beach. We got involved with the ARE a bit and then got really involved doing a newsletter for them called Ancient Mysteries. And that led me to meet a guy from England. I brought him over to the United States to give a talk at the ARE at the annual Ancient Mysteries Conference. And that was Andrew Collins of England. And that was back in 2001. Andrew has since become a very good friend. We've co-authored a couple books together. We've got another one coming out in 2022, which has been in the publisher's hands since November of this past year. So it's on its way. It's kind of everything that we ever wanted to say about UFOs and the alien mysteries and ancient aliens and all that. But I kept my feet in science while I was doing all of this. And the first book that I did on Carl Jung, on the whole UFO phenomenon, did pretty well and kind of became a cult classic. And then something very significant occurred, and that was this. My wife and I were living near what was then called Memphis State University, and I was working in a mental health unit in a prison professionally, and I started having these dreams. And I had these dreams night after night after night. Roughly 2 weeks this went on. And in the dreams, the same thing happened. Very simple dreams. I was standing on what is known as what is called an Indian mound, and I took pictures. And then all of a sudden, I'd be standing on another mound taking pictures. And another, and another, and another. The weird thing is, I had never been to an Indian mound in my life. I knew nothing whatsoever about Indian mounds, absolutely nothing. Everything that I knew about Native Americans, you could have written on the back of a postage stamp, which for your younger listeners is a little tiny piece of paper that has sticky stuff on the back. And you could put it on something called an envelope and put it in a box and somebody will deliver it anywhere for about 55 cents. So anyway, yeah, there you go. So I got into this Indian mound thing and decided to write a comprehensive encyclopedia on Indian mounds, all the mounds remaining in the United States. And I started that. That project started in 1983, actually, while the Archetype Experience was in press. It took about a year after a publisher accepted it for it to come out. So the dreams happened after I was finished with that book, Dreams of Indian Mounds, and then we started going to mounds in this big project. So this then ties it into Cayce. Then around the year 1999, one of the directors of the ARE knew my interest in Indian mounds, and he asked me, hey, why don't you take a look at what Edgar Cayce said about Indian mounds and see how it matches up with the current knowledge. So we did, and it resulted in a book called Mound Builders, Edgar Cayce's Forgotten Legacy of Ancient America, which Cayce gave about 68 readings, psychic readings, that involved Native American Indian mounds. It involved the history of the Americas. It involved history of the rest of the world, going way back into time. It talked about genetics and the movements of people. So that's how I got into all this. It was someone from the ARE asked me to do an evaluation. Totally independent, not influenced by anything, which subsequently did, and it came out in the book. So that led to one thing after another. And then without any interest in Atlantis per se, I had no desire to go search or look for anything. But then this guy, Andrew Collins from England, came over, and at the talk, we became immediate friends. But at the talk he gave, he showed a picture. And it was a picture taken in 1967 of a circular stone, what looked like a circular stone formation in the Bahamas off Andros Island. It's spelled Andros, Andros Island. It's the largest of the Bahamian islands. It's also the most empty. It's really unexplored, most of it. So this stone formation supposedly had never been found or visited. So in the course of his talk, I vividly recall turning to my wife and saying, we can find that. Let's go do that. So by the year 2000 or so, or 2001, we had the ability or the means to put together enough resources where we could start doing some expeditions. And that began expeditions, not just into the Bahamas. We spent 25 weeks in the Bahamas on boats with underwater video equipment, all kinds of video equipment. We had 3 different side scan sonars we took along, plus a lot of other stuff. We then eventually started using satellite imagery. We did lots of flyovers, low altitude flyovers. In fact, the very first one where we were trying to find that circle that I mentioned that Andrew showed, we flew into Cuban airspace under 500 feet to be sure we wouldn't be shot down. I don't know if you know this. Most people don't know this. The Cubans had actually shot down planes in the 1980s that got American planes that wandered into their airspace. So part of the Bahamas is actually in the Havana ADZ, Air Defense Zone. So you have to be very cautious flying there. So that started all of our work. It was that circle that Andrew showed on this film. It was supposedly a 500 to 1,000 foot in diameter, triple ringed stone circle. And no one had been able to find it. One group spent $30,000 trying to find that circle by flying around Andros. And the way we found it was I found the pilot who took the picture, and we went and interviewed him. I also have a pilot's license and have flown quite a bit. So he pulled out his map of the Bahamas, the pilot's map, and pointed to the exact spot. And I said, well, why has no one ever gone there or found it? And his answer was, nobody ever asked me. So that's how it all started. What I was known for, what I became known for, we got asked to do lots and lots of these expeditions to various places, including some ruins in the Yucatan that are not well known, that are very dangerous, a variety of other places in the Yucatan. But I'm pretty good at putting together the logistics. So we had backups to our backups to our backups, from everything from motors to gasoline to a second boat. We occasionally took 3 boats at the same time, a large mothership, a very fast catamaran, which was one we bought specifically for those expeditions, and then another 2-engine boat that we could use in emergencies. So we had backups of phone systems, of radio, you name it, everything. And so we really put together a systematic method of searching in the Bahamas. And we didn't really finish the project because it is a massive area. But in the course of it, of all those investigations, 25 full weeks over a period of about 10 years. Doesn't sound like a lot, but let me tell you, that is a lot. It's actually much more dangerous than people would think. You think that on a boat in the Bahamas, there's lots of other boats. There are not. In the area that we investigated repeatedly, there are no planes flying over. There are no boats that go through ever. There are no one you can radio. There's no way to radio. And satellite phones are blocked in that whole area because of the military. So if you have a problem there, you're pretty much on your own. So in the course of all that, we found 31 planes, several ships, several that were sure Spanish galleons. We didn't do anything with them but report it. We found lots of archaeological ruins of all different kinds. We had lots of things carbon dated. We had lots of things analyzed in geological labs. Really tried to stick the science to it. So the New Age sort of community embraced all this, and all the people into alternative history and really wanting to know the truth about this embraced most of the work we did. But of course, most of the mainstream ignored it or ridiculed it, except for a few mainstream archaeologists who really believe in it all. They think there is something there. They believe in Atlantis, but they say, never mention my name, never talk about what we did with you or any of our work, because we will never get another grant, we'll never get another contract, and our careers will be over. So we've tried to maintain that. So that's kind of a summary of how I got there. Of course, I had to skip over. I'm 71 years old, man, so I've been around a bit.
I'm 69, so I'm just right behind you.
There you go.
You know, one thing you said is kind of interesting, and Dave and I do a lot of programs on UFOs. Dave's written a book on UFOs. I'm a part of MUFON, their experiencers research team.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
The idea of being grounded in science, but being able to kind of project yourself into these new age pursuits, that has some liabilities that come with it. And you just talked about those liabilities, which if you start talking about UFOs in some circles, you're marginalized.
Absolutely.
So it's tough. Yeah, I give you a lot of credit for being able to kind of straddle that fence, so to speak.
It's a tough fence to straddle. Believe me, we've got a thunderstorm going on here, so you may see some flashes. I just heard it myself. A lot of my colleagues want me to keep all this as low key as possible. One of the things that we did from roughly 2003 to 2012 is we got on a whole lot of documentaries. We were on 3 episodes of National Geographic. They did the very best episode we've ever been on. It's when we found some Bermuda Triangle planes, and they pulled parts out. They sent the parts to England, to the Royal Air Force, and they identified them and found where they came from. And they did come from Bermuda Triangle planes that disappeared there. They did the best one, but they also did the worst one, the very worst one. And they sanitized it, according to the producer, who told us after the fact. He got fired because he was just trying to present it straightforward, and they didn't want anything archaeological to be in the Bahamas, so it was sanitized. Anyway, okay, so my colleagues got very nervous from roughly 2003 to 2012 when we started showing up on History Channel series called, good gosh, I can't remember now. We've been on 4 different History Channel shows, 2 different series, National Geographic, BBC, Canadian television, a bunch of shows up there on Vision TV and some others. the Discovery Channel, Discovery Kids, the Learning Channel, the Travel Channel. We did all these shows. So I was getting a higher and higher profile. And I was asked to do a series on archaeology with probably the History Channel. I say that because it was a guy who was working for National Geographic that made the offer. And my colleagues, professional colleagues, just said, no, don't do it. It'll hurt us professionally. Huh. And has it? I do know this, that there was an article that came out a few years ago that called me, that was against MRT, or treatment. They don't want any treatment for substance abusers because the philosophy that this writer had is that there's nothing wrong with substance abusers. It's all because drugs are illegal. That's the issue. I don't want to get into that, but the person attacked MRT because MRT treats substance abusers, and it has pretty successfully for a long, long time. Well, there's hundreds of articles that say that it works, but in describing me as the first author and primary creator of it, they call me a UFO theorist.
Really?
Yes. In an article
about MRT.
About MRT, they said, "Oh, he's a UFO theorist," which I found really interesting. And it's a way to denigrate someone. It's a way to call into question. I mean, they could just as easily call me a former Tasty Freeze employee, because I worked at a Tasty Freeze when I was a kid. So, you know, the other thing was that doing a series was going to burn up all my time. It takes a great deal of time. And let me tell you, when you do these shows or you do these series for these cable documentary programs, you really aren't out there doing research. You're going somewhere that's already pre-planned, and you're pretty much reenacting whatever you did. And the very first one we did, they asked us to reenact the discovery of this massive formation underwater in Andros in the Bahamas, because they couldn't afford to fly to Andros. They didn't want to fly all the way to Andros Island. So they asked us to fake it at Bimini and pretend we're finding it right then, which we wouldn't do. So anyway, it gets in the way of actually doing research, of doing things, and all of them try to hook you by saying, yeah, we want to be right there when you do research, but they don't. They want to be right there looking at what you've already found and have you reenacted, and that's the way almost all of them are. Has this hurt us in terms of the treatment programs that I represent or that use the various programs that I've done? I don't really know. I have no way of knowing. There are very few people that I have met professionally that said, oh, you know, you have an interest in UFOs, therefore you are a kook, and everything you do is kooky. But that's the assumption some of them make. One skeptic in particular does that all the time. Says if you're interested in it, you believe anything's real about it, then anything you do is called into question.
Seems to me to be a pretty limited view of reality.
Well, it is, but it is the way skeptics attack.
Who is this particular skeptic? Michael Shermer?
I know who he is, but the answer is no. It's not Shermer. I haven't read much of his. You know, I don't really. You could look up skeptics. You could put my name in Google. And one of the things that I try to do is to not attack anybody by name, not just for legal reasons, but I grew up with the philosophy that if you can't say something nice about people, or at least friendly, you don't really say it. So I don't really write much negative stuff about others. That's not true. I take that back. I have written, I got to be honest, I have, suddenly it's popping into my head. I have written some things that are very negative about a few people, and it started with Edgar Cayce when I did that Mound book, looking at Edgar Cayce's readings, because I stumbled upon a book written by Stephen Williams of Harvard University and Kenneth Fader of the University of Southern Connecticut, or something like that. It's in Connecticut. Anyway, they both wrote books. One of them, the guy from Harvard, wrote a book. It's an archaeology textbook that says Edgar Cayce plagiarized his readings from Ignatius Donnelly. And he said that Donnelly is mentioned all over the place in Edgar Cayce's readings. And then he cites a book called Edgar Cayce on Atlantis, written by Edgar Evans Cayce.
That's Casey's son, right?
That is correct. I actually called and interviewed Stephen Williams of Harvard University, and I asked him about that. I said, I've done a thorough search of the Cayce readings. If you're a member or a life member as I am, I can only get out if I die, by the way. And then if I'm reincarnated, damn, I'm back in. Anyway, I told him that not a single Edgar Cayce reading ever had the name Donnelly in it, Ignatius Donnelly, who wrote some of the 1800s books on Atlantis. I said, Edgar Cayce never mentioned Donnelly at all in a reading, not one. And he said, yes, he did. And I said, no, he didn't. And he said, it's in that book. And I said, that book is not written by Edgar Cayce, the psychic. That book is written by Edgar Cayce's son, who's named Edgar Evans Cayce. And I said, he was comparing what his dad said to Ignatius Donnelly's material, saying that it doesn't match up entirely. And he said, well, you wouldn't understand. You have a doctorate, but it's not in archaeology, so you can't possibly understand. He literally said that. I put that in the book. That's what's in writing. It's what's in my notes. I should have recorded the conversation with him, but he got very angry over that. And I said, how do you know that that was in the readings? And he said, because it's in that book. And I said, it's not there. So we had a couple other things that he had written, all of which were absolute nonsense. I mean, I know where he got it from, but it's fake. He got angry and basically hung up. Now, Ken Fader, who is an ultra skeptic also, Ken Fader was a little nicer. He was actually very, very professional. I sent Fader Fader had these quotes in his book, textbook on archaeology and fraud, and he calls Edgar Cayce a pseudo-archaeologist. And I had one of the things I said is, Cayce's never done archaeology. Cayce never wrote an article about archaeology. He never investigated any sites. He never made any claims. And he said, well, in the readings, he talked about history. And I said, okay, all right. But so you're calling him a pseudo-archaeologist, even though this is a dead psychic who never did anything in the field. But here was the important thing. Fader cited this article about Cayce that made a whole bunch of claims about Edgar, about past lives and people telling Edgar things and where Atlantis came from and so on. And I told Fader, I said, this reference you're citing in your textbook does not exist. I said, everything you've said in this paragraph about Cayce is untrue. It does not exist. And he said, give me a little time. Let me go find where I got this from. Let me get my notes. And he did. And sure enough, he came back and he said, I am sorry. He said, I have no idea where this came from. He said, it was in some notes. I can't find it either. I have searched. It probably doesn't exist. And then Fader did change the next edition of his textbook on it. But I found so many other things written by archaeologists about Cayce that are just absolute nonsense. For a while, I did write some negative stuff. So I'm trying to get back to that. And then I realized this is hopeless. It is absolutely hopeless. The only other time I got really upset was when a geologist who made fake artifacts, the U.S. Geological Survey professional geologist, made fake artifacts in his U.S. Geological Survey laboratory in Miami, Florida. He then took them over to the Bahamas and he planted these fake artifacts in the Bahamas under stones in the hopes that somebody like us would find them and then announce it. And then he could say, oh, I hoaxed that and made fun of you. But he did this. The U.S. Geological Survey was aware of it when he did it. There were universities that were aware of it when he did it, and none of them see anything wrong with it, although it is illegal to do that.
Unethical.
Oh, absolutely. And I asked him about it too. I had a bunch of interactions with the geologist. He was the prime skeptic about Bimini and the Bimini Road. he basically lied in most of his magazine articles because what he wrote in those articles, which is the only thing anybody reads, is the opposite of what's in the scientific literature, which he will not provide to people. I've got it. But anyway, it's a long, involved story, but what it did 15, 16 years ago was tell me that it's kind of a hopeless battle fighting them because the truth doesn't matter.
Yeah, especially the sense of entitlement that you must have in academia when you have the full weight of the peer group that upholds these this orthodoxy. They don't need to prove it to them. It's already proven, and so they can do unethical things like just make stuff up, fabricate things because it supports. I mean, it's the ends justify the means, supported by the weight of the consensus, which can't be challenged. And really it can't, because it's so pervasive throughout media and every other place. So you're right. I mean, it's even if you have the evidence that they require, they'll just move the goalpost later.
Exactly.
And say, that's not good enough. You need to blah, blah, but you need to publish in 4 journals, not just 2. And then when you hit 4, you got to hit 8, and it's the wrong journals. So it's stacked against you no matter what. But when you were kind of giving your 20-minute summary, which has gotten to 40 now, but we haven't stopped you because it's all very
I'm enjoying it. I don't know.
Interesting. And I mean, we don't need to cut in or add anything. It's good how it is. I just wanted to say, when I wrote down like 8 questions that came to mind in the first 20 minutes. So I've got some things, rather than ask you questions, I wanted to just throw out a few names and then have you kind of riff on that, your feelings about these names, these players. And I'm sure you've run across them in your studies. The Flem-Aths, Rose and Rand, I believe, they have an idea about Atlantis. Now, don't start on them yet, but I'm going to throw them out. Have you heard of Carl Monk?
Yep.
Okay. Atlantis Rising.
Yeah. The magazine, or the guy that's actually something Edgar Cayce said in the reading.
Well, the magazine I meant. Yeah.
And then, that's Doug Kenyon. Yeah, I've written for his magazine. I know Doug also personally.
I assumed you had. It's defunct now, I'm sure, but.
Well, actually, he's got an online thing now. He made it defunct, but still.
Okay, so Graham Hancock and then Michael Cremo. Let's throw those names out there and see just what what you say about that group.
I know Graham personally. I like him. He is in England, he is the monster fish. He is the whale in the very small pond that is the UK. Right. Graham is the whale over there. Very deep thinker, but he's kind of a loner. Graham is kind of on his own with this. The main way I came to know Graham is through Andrew Collins, the British author who's also on almost every episode of Ancient Aliens. Andrew had a competing theory with Graham and Robert Bauval's theory about the 3 pyramids at Giza being aligned to Orion's belt. Andrew, for years, starting in 2004, has argued that the 3 pyramids at Giza are aligned to the Cygnus constellation. The Cygnus is the northern cross. So Andrew had this idea. In 2006, he came out with a book. I really read that carefully and came to understand that there is a lot more to this than what anybody realized. And I believe that, and wrote in a book, that Bauval encountered a trickster when he came up with the idea, which he didn't really come up with it. It was one of the herdsmen that did. But he came up with the idea that the 3 belt stars of Orion are what the pyramids mimic. But I think it was a trickster, and a trickster misleads you. A trickster often gives you part of the truth, enough to where you'll stop looking. And the whole idea of the Native American trickster is you have to get past the first tricking. To get to the truth, you have to be able to see through that and move on. But I knew there was something to Andrew's idea about Cygnus, because I started finding it in Native American literature and Native American lore and alignments and mound sites and so on. So Graham finally It was at a conference we were at together 3 years ago. Graham stood up and said, yeah, okay, so Cygnus is part of this whole thing, and it's Orion and Cygnus together is part of it, and it's called the Path of Souls. But I like Graham, but he's the big fish. He is it. I don't really know a great deal about Michael Cremo. I've read one book by him, the big book, but I don't know much else. Otto Mook is the guy that came up with the idea that you mentioned him very early. I think it was the second name you mentioned. He had a book. I don't remember the name of it, but the whole idea is that Atlantis was destroyed by what we call the Carolina Bays event, roughly 10,000 BC or so. Andrew Collins wrote about it. I actually have a copy of Mook's book somewhere here, but I'm finding it's not going to be easy.
Now, wait. I don't.
Yes, sir. Otto Mook, is that who you said?
Oh, no. But I think I know who you're talking about, who also fits in. Everyone kind of fits in at some.
Oh, there's the
juncture here. No, I said Carl Munk, Munck.
Nope, don't know that.
He wrote a book. He was speaking of loners, he was kind of off in his own place, but he wrote this big book called The Code, I think. Simply, okay. I don't even know if it was actually published formally, but what he said, his model was that these different Indian mounds and the Great Pyramid and all these, ancient landmarks were connected in a grid. And so he looked he used the, coordinates and blah, blah, blah. But he painted this picture. Carl Munk, Munck.
No, I'm not familiar.
Just because you mentioned the
Otto Mook.
the Indian the mounds,
yes.
Midwest United States in particular, or the northeastern, eastern, I guess. A lot of Chicago or like Illinois.
Oh yeah, loads of them in Illinois.
Up in those areas. But anyway, yeah, he's somebody. The other person I mentioned, let's see, who was it? Oh, the Flem Aths with the Atlantis.
Yeah, I stepped away for just a moment. Okay, so to try and just sum up all that. Okay, so there are so many theories about Atlantis that virtually everywhere on the world, I don't know of a single place now that's an exception. Mm-hmm. Someone has theorized that Atlantis was everywhere in the world.
Right.
And there is evidence. If you look, you will find evidence almost all the places where they say that Atlantis might have existed. So what does that mean? It's like we found a lot of evidence in the Bahamas for a maritime culture. The longest date we could go back to where we had what we would call real archaeological evidence is to about 3000 BC, which Atlantis supposedly ended roughly 10,000 BC, 9600 BC according to Plato. But we know that according to Plato, and even Edgar Cayce said it, Atlantis began right outside the Straits of Gibraltar, which were known as the Pillars of Hercules, and extended across the true ocean, is what Plato called it. You could hop from island to island and you would reach the opposite continent. So what that would tell us is that if Plato was correct, what Atlantis really was an island empire. Now, everybody thinks about the central city of Atlantis that Plato described, and they think that it's a little circle, a little tiny circular island that had those rings and canals around it. But it wasn't. It was an island that was basically the size of modern Cuba. That is how big Atlantis was. The main island of Atlantis was about the size of Cuba, according to Plato. On the very southern side of this island, at the very bottom of it, is where the center city was located. The center city had a diameter of 1.5 miles. That's it, 1.5 miles. And then it had these 3 concentric rings of canals that went around the center city. To the north of the center city, there was a flat land that had all kinds of canals sort of running in all different directions to water the land. And north of that was a huge mountain range that kept the cold air away. And it had 2 growing seasons. Now, all that comes directly from Plato. In 10,000 BC, it was the end of the last ice age. That is true. But the ice sheets were still covering roughly half of North America, and they were covering most of Europe and close to the Mediterranean. The ice sheets actually got close to the Mediterranean. So if Atlantis existed 10,000 BC and before, it had to be south of really the Mason-Dixon line. And so an area like Cuba would fit, but it's one of many, many areas that people have said there is evidence of Atlantis. And Cuba was Andrew Collins' favorite place. That's where he believes Atlantis was. Cayce said it was the islands of the Bahamas. He didn't talk about Cuba particularly, but back then it was all known as the West Indies anyway. He talked about the West Indies islands were all remnants of the lost continent of Atlantis. But both Plato and Cayce essentially said it was an island empire, and it was a a maritime culture that apparently went all over the world. And that's why people find remains of it along Spain and Portugal and parts of England. And you probably all the way down to India. You go down even further and around, you can probably find pieces of it up and down the coastline everywhere over there. That is what it was. I think the civilizations have been destroyed before. Whatever it was not completely destroyed, but almost. And in 10,000 BC, the sea levels were a minimum of 300 feet lower than they are today. So a lot of the ports and a lot of the land, a lot of the building structures that would have been part of Atlantis are underwater. And that is what we looked for in the Bahamas. And that's what we think we found. We didn't find it. We were part of a team that found these structures. But to really find the remnants of Atlantis, you have to look at the 10,000 BC shoreline. And that's what we started doing. And people that are going to like Spain and looking for it, they're not looking at the 10,000 BC shoreline. They're looking inland. They're looking at things that are round. Everybody's looking for a round structure and saying this is Atlantis. Mm-hmm. So all these people, the people that have talked about Antarctica, people that have talked, even Iceland has been considered to be a part of Atlantis by some, and Greenland, and God knows all of North America has been called it, South America has been called it, Central America. All the islands in the Caribbean have been called portions of Atlantis, and then all over the Mediterranean, you have places everywhere they're pretending to be Atlantis. So maybe it was all part of this massive maritime culture. That's my belief.
Yeah, that's something that it makes perfect sense when you accept the idea that there have been past civilizations. Of course, mainstream archaeology and history in general doesn't accept that as a real possibility. I mean, we look back and we say, yeah, Mesopotamia and whatever, sure. There were civilizations, sure, thousands of years ago, but they were primitive. And that was the first one. And we all evolved from there to where we are here.
And now we know that's not true. But we know that for sure with the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey.
Yes, exactly.
It goes back to 10,000 BC.
At least, too.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
so
maybe 15 or 20.
It's very possible. That's Andrew Collins' specialty. So we know there is some sort of lost history that is very, very important, some critical pieces that we're not seeing. I want to say this real quickly. I'm very familiar with the earth grids people talk about and how mounds and certain pyramid sites are supposedly aligned on these grids, power grids, Gaia, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. If you really look at when people start drawing these, they have to exclude a lot of mounds. Otherwise, there's way too many lines. They also have to exclude a lot of pyramids. One very simple example can be seen in the Yucatan. If you've ever flown over the Yucatan, what you see are massive areas of what look like dense jungle. And it is now believed that under all that dense jungle are ruins. It was like solid ruins almost everywhere. So how are you going to connect? How do you make lines from something that big to, say, over to Giza? Plus, keep in mind that Egypt has 100, I don't know the exact number now. The last time I looked, it was 110. I think Egypt has roughly 110 pyramids. It's awful close to that number in total. Well, Cahokia, Illinois, where the largest mountain complex is in North America, has 120 mounds, including the largest mound in North America, which has a base 1 acre larger than the Great Pyramid at Giza.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So there's 120 mounds in that one place. North America probably had over 1 million mounds. By the way, I'd mentioned I started on that project on mounds in 1983. I'm showing the guys this. This is the result of this. This is this massive encyclopedia that I did finish in 2016. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to talk about how that happened too, because of weird experiences there. That's a lot of work. Yeah, that's a lot of work. It's got over 2,000 mound sites in it that are still around that you can still visit. But you can't, the grid things, they're trying to use mathematics, which is good, to connect something that probably isn't as uniform as they think. I believe that the Earth has certain intersection areas where there's an intersection of different forces. And these different forces can produce, and I might as well say it, an electromagnetic influence. Mm-hmm. Everything in my theories goes to the electromagnetic energy spectrum. John Keel and, believe it or not,
John Keel.
Yep, right. Carl Jung. John Keel and Carl Jung were the first two to talk about this. In fact, Carl Jung mentioned it before John Keel did. I don't think Keel ever read Jung. Keel called it the spectrum theory because it was the electromagnetic energy spectrum he was talking about. But I believe that is the answer to most of it. I'm not saying that they're not real, because all this stuff certainly is real in its own way. But I don't think that it's found uniformly on the face of the Earth. I think there are intersection areas. Keel called them window areas where weird things happen over and over. The shaman in ancient times had the way to connect with that and to sense that this is a place where all of these energies interconnect and emerge, and we can immerse ourselves so that we can commune with these energies. And that is how the shaman and the mounds fit into this picture. They saw things very similar to what we would call UFOs, the ancient shaman. They saw things very similar to what we would call aliens, little people, little gray people. They just call them the little people. They saw lights in the sky. They could produce some lights. I used to do that in my talks when I get all the lights out, and I would create little electromagnetic lights through the use of crystals and crushing quartz crystals in front of people. You got to make sure that they're not going to fly everywhere, and that's another story. But to me, it is electromagnetic, but it's not so uniform that you can draw a grid pattern, and everywhere that this perfectly uniform grid hits, you're going to find something. That's not the case. At least I don't think it is. I kind of wish it was. It would make it easier.
It's kind of an exercise in connecting the dots, which can get really tricky because it sounds very rigorous mathematically, but it's a lot of randomness that's creating order out of nothing, really. So I get what you're saying. I think what we should be focusing on, though, is that what you just said is that there are pieces of Atlantis all over the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the big picture. We should say, look, there was a civilization. There's actually a book called Civilization 1. Have you read that? I can't remember the author, but
no, I've not.
It's a good book. People want to look at that, but it's implying that there were prior civilizations itself is a revelation.
Absolutely. Plato said it. In Plato's dialogues, he said that there have been prior civilizations on Earth, and that from time to time, the movement of bodies in the heavens caused disasters on Earth and they wipe out the civilization, and then they forget, and they rebuild. And he said it had happened several times. Edgar Cayce said it had happened several times too. He talked about 3 destructions of Atlantis, and before Atlantis, he said there was an even older civilization. And it's like now, all right, so how old, in your knowledge, how far back do human beings go? How far back do we go? Well, I'll give you a quick answer. This is in the new book with Andrew and I. Okay, they're now pulling evidence out of caves in Israel of human beings carving artifacts 600,000 years ago.
Wow.
600,000 years. And this group called the Denisovans, we know they were 400,000 years old. They had what is being described as high-speed drills to produce, actually they produced a bracelet out of a green stone, a green gemstone, and they were able to drill a perfect hole for it to put bangles on it. That was found in the Denisova cave by mainstream archaeologists, and that goes back to at least 100,000 years or more. So everything is being pushed back. Andrew actually went to Israel in the preparation of a new book that we've done together. Andrew went to Israel, visited the archaeologists at a university in Jerusalem. They took him to the site. They let him hold the artifacts. They answered every single question he had. And they are convinced that there was something much, much older that was there that has been wiped from memory. So we're talking about 600,000 years here. I mean, that is an astonishing long time. When in graduate school, I remember being told that the first fully modern humans came out or emerged maybe 60,000 years ago, maybe 60,000 years ago. With mitochondrial DNA research and what they call mitochondrial Eve, well, they have pushed that back to roughly 200,000 years ago or 220,000 years ago. And by the way, Edgar Cayce said the very first fully modern human emerged 220,000 years ago. And that person emerged in Atlantis, and there were already other people living in areas around the earth that were less advanced humans, but they weren't fully modern humans. Cayce actually said there were 5 different versions of us, most of which were destroyed. So it's all very interesting. We still don't have answers, but it's really a fascinating topic. The mainstream, I don't think, will ever accept it. The one thing we have over them that they don't have, and it just galls them to no end, is that we, meaning alternative historians, can write books about this. And then they're so upset, and they said, these people are all just greedy and after money and all, trying to sell books for money. But they can't do that because their careers will be destroyed. Even if they believe everything we said, they couldn't even agree with us.
You know, I'm wondering, I'm thinking about Plato here to a certain degree, and the fact that many of the things he wrote about were allegorical.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of the allegory of the cave. And it seems to me that some people have jumped on that. I'm thinking of some of the skeptics. And then they use that to argue, well, Plato really wasn't talking about an actual civilization. He was talking about Atlantis representing an allegorical story about how Athens should have been. So you see that conundrum?
I have, the only answer I have for that is that if you believe everything Plato wrote is allegory, then that means nothing that he wrote is historically true. So my question would be, if you look at all of Plato's writings, did he mention anybody who historically lived? Did he mention historical truths in it? And the truth is, in the story of Atlantis itself, he mentioned a line of people going back in time and actual places in Egypt, Sais, where the story came from, and the people visiting there, and the actual temples. All those things are in his Timaeus and Critias. But I don't believe everything Plato wrote was allegorical. Yes, he wrote some tales of morality for the people, absolutely.
But Plato's account was based on, is it Solon?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was.
But Solon got it from another person who got it from another, Dropadius, and it goes back to the Temple of Sais.
So if his report was his report, whether it originated in someone's imagination, I guess you could debate. But Plato clearly was just reporting what he had learned. So to say that he's
making it up,
it's not logical to make that conclusion. Obviously, that conclusion is just to discount it altogether. But when you look at the genesis of it, it's more complicated than that.
Well, one complication is this. I would have a question. Would it be simpler for him to just tell the morality in a much straighter fashion rather than come up with an entire story of a lost civilization and talk about their actual weapons and the number of horses they had and the number of camels they had and the exact size of the island and the exact size of the center city and how long it took to build it and what the buildings were and how big the buildings were and their actual size? Is that necessary to talk about the morality of Greece in his time? No,
You're talking about somebody who valued simplicity, right? With the Platonic solids, for example. It's like, let's boil it down to
what's needed.
Fundamental, right?
Right.
So to elaborate on some story that just has so many details, it obviously was defeating his purpose, if that was his purpose in the first place. And clearly it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, the story is way too specific to simply be a tale of morality. And he never ended it. It ended in the very ending of it. It ended with what the gods were going to do. And Atlantis was punished by the gods, but we don't know how. Something probably came from the sky. Edgar Cayce's story talks about something coming from the sky and destroying it, some massive disaster. And I believe that's probably what happened, whether it was the Carolina Bays event, whether it was the Younger Dryas period right before it, something happened then. I don't know. It matters, but it only matters when we find out what the truth is. Right now, it's all speculation. But I think all of it happened. I think Plato was telling a story that he heard that may have fit his time. Just like we often tell stories. I hear people talking about America's Civil War now because it sort of fits what's going on in our society at the time. But that doesn't mean that the Civil War never happened. It simply means people are finding it useful to discuss it right now with what's happening in our modern culture. And I think Plato may have done the exact same thing. There's this incredible story from the past. And yes, I think there's evidence of the story. Cayce's story, unlike Plato, Cayce gave a beginning of Atlantis. And it happened in that 210 to 220,000 BC when the first genetically modern human emerged on Atlantis. That is where, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm going to bring it back to Cayce here. Not that Atlantis is not interesting, but I find Edgar Cayce a very interesting person. So how accurate was he? And what I've heard and read, but just because you've heard it and read it doesn't necessarily mean it's true, that Cayce was way more accurate when it came to his health readings than some of the other things he prophesied. What would you say about that?
I would say that you are absolutely correct. I have looked at all of the scientific art. There's actually been scientific articles published in medical journals on Edgar Cayce's readings and analyses of them. One of them actually, this was in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA. It's the top of the line. That journal called Edgar Cayce the father of holistic health, because he really was the very first to give all these holistic health remedies out and say, if you do this stuff, it will help keep you healthy. Okay, so all of the articles that have analyzed Cayce's health readings are pretty consistent. The lowest I've ever seen was roughly 82%, and it goes on up to 88 to 90% accuracy. That is not to say that the 10% that is inaccurate was wrong, they weren't able to identify what happened after people tried the remedies because they couldn't find the people. Curiously, there are people now that turn up at the ARE, and they're brought in on a regular basis, who had health readings from Edgar Cayce in the 1930s and 40s, who are now coming to the ARE and talking about their experience, which is quite interesting. So that's a summary of his health readings. It's somewhere between 82, 83 to 88, maybe 90% accurate. The rest of them, hard to say. I've never found one where he was dead wrong. Never. All right. So when you get to other areas, there's spirituality, there's history, there's things like mound builders, and then there are predictions that Cayce made. Although in all of his predictions, that's what he's attacked most. For example, you hear that Cayce predicted that California and Japan will fall into the ocean in 1998. Totally untrue. He did not say that it was going to fall into the ocean in 1998. Edgar Cayce said that the future is not set, that if what happens in the present doesn't change, here's what could very well happen in the near future. He did say that a new age was going to begin in roughly 1998. And he said in this new age, turmoil would begin occurring in several spots around the earth, and that eventually Japan would have disasters and California would have disasters. So there's a lot of other prophecies that he has made that have not come to pass, including China becoming Christian. That is one of the things he said was going to happen. It would be the largest Christian country in the world at some point. I'm trying to think of a few others. The fifth root race is supposed to have begun. I believe that has to do with something very unusual with mitochondrial DNA. In terms of his history readings and his readings on mounds, in our analysis, we came up with 72% of his mound builder readings were correct. I was able to find one of the readings that was absolutely wrong. Absolutely. I have no doubt at all that he was wrong. In the I think 68 readings, one of them was dead wrong. One or two others probably are wrong, but we're not certain. Most of the others were correct, and there were some we didn't have enough evidence yet to even analyze. We did it also in South America. He gave a bunch of facts, what he considered facts about South American archaeology and dates and the movements of people. We did a book on South America in 2002, and in that we found that about 80% of what he said was verified at that time in terms of the movements of people in and out of South America, which would have been a surprise too, since Edgar Cayce said people came into South America 50,000 years ago. So, and at the time he said it was preposterous. Now we know that's true. That's absolutely for certain.
What is known about the origins of Cayce's psychic abilities? Were his parents psychic?
No.
I remember a story about, and I don't know if this is accurate or not. Once again, what you hear could be accurate or not, that early in Cayce's life, he was having trouble in school, and his father challenged him to learn something that he wasn't learning. And Cayce actually put a book underneath his pillow and slept on the book, and that enhanced his ability to understand the material. Was that accurate?
Well, that's what's in some of one of the first books. And the story was Edgar. It's a real specific story. Edgar, I believe, was 12 years old at the time, doing very poorly in spelling. The teacher sent a note home with him and said that Edgar came home late to the farm because he couldn't spell the word cabin, C-A-B-I-N. I can spell it, cabin. He couldn't spell the word. So Edgar's dad got very, very angry. Edgar was crying and said, just let me sleep on the book for a while. Edgar went to his room, supposedly slept on the book, came out. His dad then opened the book, and Edgar said, ask me any word on any page. And he did. He knew every word. And he said, all right, why don't you look at page? He gave him the page number. Look at the fifth word down. Here's what it is. Here's how you spell it. And Edgar actually had the ability to do this. One of the stories that I've told in this new book with Andrew, it's a story that happened shortly after this, and it was a U.S. congressman that had been just appointed to be U.S. ambassador to Peru. He was a congressman from Kentucky. He went to Cayce's home in Hopkinsville, near the Kelly Hopkinsville ferry case, UFO case. He lived 7 miles
I'm familiar with that.
7 miles. There you go. 7 miles from Kelly Hopkinsville. By the way, Edgar saw little people, little beings throughout his life. When he was a kid, he saw all these little people. He talked to dead people. He saw ghosts and all that. So it wasn't anything that just suddenly happened with him. But anyway,
his grandfather too, didn't he?
Yes, that's when it stopped.
Passed.
That's when it started. His grandfather fell off of a horse, knocked himself out, and he fell face first into a puddle of water, and Edgar watched him drown. And then after that, his grandfather hung around, talked to him all the time. That's how it all started. So, okay, back to my little story. Edgar's father was bragging to this congressman about how good Edgar could memorize anything. Said, you don't even need to let him see it. You can let him see a page and he'll know everything on it, or you can just read it to him and he'll remember it word for word. And the congressman said, well, I just did this speech. It was a 105-page speech right before I was about to leave for Peru. I said, I bet he can't memorize that. Edgar's dad made a $20 bet with this congressman. This is documented in newspapers covered this at the time because it was this U.S. congressman is now an ambassador. So Edgar's dad, in front of the congressman, read this 105-page speech to Edgar before Edgar went to bed. Edgar got up the next day, and he was never allowed to touch the speech. Congressman took it with him. The next day in his schoolhouse, there were 50 kids in the room. All the teachers were there. 4 or 5 is all they had. But there were several newspaper reporters. The congressman and his entourage were all there. Edgar stood up, no notes, nothing, and recited all 105 pages, word for word, perfectly. The congressman was absolutely astonished. That was written up in the Kentucky New Era. So he had what's called eidetic memory. In psychology, eidetic memory remains a somewhat controversial topic. Some psychologists don't believe it exists. Like you can look at a page and you make a photographic memory of it so you can read it. But Edgar apparently had this ability. My belief about his experience with the spelling book and sleeping on it, I think Edgar probably looked through these books before he fell asleep, and then he fell asleep. We all know that memory is consolidated with sleep. If you go to sleep after you do some studying, you'll remember a whole lot better. And eidetic memory apparently is helped by that. That's my belief about Edgar and that ability.
Great story. Great story.
Well, he was an extraordinary person for sure. I mean, just trying to describe his multiple talents is just...
Well, let me give you I suppose I need to give a caution here. My wife and I are both lifetime members. My wife is the chairperson of the board of trustees of the ARE, the Edgar Cayce Foundation, and their university called Atlantic University. I'm hoping this is her last year. She has only 1 more year that she can do it because they have a maximum limit of 3 years on that, and she was a board member before. So we are still very involved in it, but I'm just straightforward honest about it. Not everything Cayce did was correct, and not everything that he said was correct. But even he said that the visions that people have under these influences, when you are under hypnotic trance, you don't always see things clearly. And he also had an entity that spoke through him now and then called Haliel, Haliel. And it gave some pretty weird readings. Those are actually a whole special group of readings that people study, the Haliel readings. So that's kind of a synopsis of it.
Is the ARE looking for another Edgar Cayce or someone like him? And maybe they'll never find anyone like that.
Cayce had a dream that he reincarnated into Nebraska in 2500 something. That was a dream, and that's well documented in the Cayce archives. There have been numerous people who have claimed to be Edgar Cayce reincarnated. The ARE has a system that Edgar Cayce put in place and his family put in place to identify if the reincarnated Edgar Cayce actually does walk into the ARE and say, hey, give me the test. No one has passed the test to date. But a lot of people have claimed to be Cayce, including some pretty well-known ones.
So, Dave, I'm looking at our clock here, and I see we've got about 10 more minutes with Greg. Is there someplace you want to take us? Or, Greg, is there something else you'd like to talk about before we wrap our time up?
Yeah, exploring. Exploring is very, very cool. You have to be stupidly courageous. You have to be careful and have enough backups for what you're doing. So that requires having some resources. But I will say this, we had a lot of very, very strange experiences while we were in the Bahamas. Of course, as I said, we're out there 25 weeks. That means 25 weeks worth of nights. And a lot of those nights, the sky is incredible. Storms are amazing. Things pop up instantly. I filmed 5 water spouts at one time coming to us. We went into crashed planes that were 30, 40 feet underwater, and we pulled the pilot's pants out with his passport in his pants. Of course, the pilot wasn't in there, but we know it was the pilot because it was a pilot's seat, and it was in his bag. But we had a lot of strange experiences. We saw unusual lights at night in the sky, and when we saw them, we would call other people back, like where we were in the boat, and say, just sit back here with us. And then they would see them, so we knew we weren't hallucinating. Green, red, white, blue lights popping on and off in the sky. We saw lights in the water. There were times when it got so calm in the Atlantic Ocean. We're talking about in the ocean. You see no land anywhere on the horizon. There's no land that's visible. But the water is as smooth as glass and a mirror. I'm not exaggerating a bit. No clouds in the sky. And it is the most bizarre phenomenon that you can see, because when you look out, you cannot see the water and you can't see the sky. Everything is just solid blue. It's just blue because the water is reflecting that blue sky. And it is strange. And we had a lot of weird things happen when that phenomenon occurred. It occurred 3 or 4 different times over the course of those 25 weeks. And it's pretty unusual. There are magnetic anomalies out there. It is true that some, not magnetometers, but some of your directional magnets do start spinning. You can be led to the wrong place. Cell phones don't work out there. There's no cell phone reception. There's no reception. There's no satellite phones that work. There's a lot of, go ahead.
Well, and I'm just trying to think of my geography where you were at. Were you not in the Bermuda Triangle?
Yeah, it's all in the Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah, and so that would explain all these legends about the Bermuda Triangle.
It would have a lot to do with it, yes. And we had one very weird experience. I'll end with this. We were on our boat, which is a very fast catamaran. It can go 60 miles an hour. It has 2 engines, and we had a mothership. It was like a 50-foot liveaboard. And the mothership was supposed to meet us. It would stay in deeper water, and then we would run, and we'd use our side scan sonar looking for things in grids. But we were much faster than the mothership. So the mothership was supposed to meet us roughly 30 miles away one day, and they had all the coordinates. So we got to the coordinates. We were there an hour after they were supposed to be there. They were nowhere to be found. That was one of the days when the water became glass. And we sat there, and we used the radio, and we used the backup radio, and we used the third radio. Nothing, absolutely nothing. So I pulled out a good camera, movie quality camera, gave it to my wife and said, film this. And I vividly recall this. I said, this is how people disappear in the Bermuda Triangle, because we didn't have much gas left. We refilled gas every night on the mothership. I said, we're out here. I mentioned where we were, 30 miles off land. We had enough gas to probably make it to the Gulf Stream and then float north through the night. And that was part of the plan. But I said, this is how people disappear. And when we got home, we did get saved, and I'll tell you how. But when we got home, I really wanted, because I was trying to do a show on the Bermuda Triangle, and I really wanted that piece of film. Of all the film we did, not a second of that came out. Of all the thousands of hours we did. Okay, so what happened is we turned it off, and we said in the radio, we said, we don't know if you can hear us or not. in 1 hour from now, we are going to go, and we told them we're out 20 miles into the Gulf Stream. We're going to shut the engine off, and we're going to float through the night because the Gulf Stream moves 7-8 miles an hour, goes north. And through 7-8 miles through the night, we'd be far enough north that we could get to an island where we might be able to get some gas. So that was our hope. And then we heard a click on that smallest handheld radio, just a click. And the Bahamian that was with us, his name was Esley, had very good eyes. My eyes were never as good as Esley's. And Esley said, I see a man. I said, what? And he said, there's a guy standing on the water.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so we looked out. You could see out. Now, people don't know this, the curvature of the ocean. In general, you can see about 5 to 6 miles on the ocean. That's about it. Because the curvature of the earth, everything then falls below. So you can see about 5 to 6 miles out with something like a person, at the height of a person. And then as we watched, we saw what looked like a guy coming toward us. And then he started lifting up into the air. And then we could see, but then the whole ship appeared, and he had climbed to the top of the mast of this mothership, and he was waving like crazy because he was afraid we were going to take off. Their radio had failed. In fact, everything electronic on board except their engines had failed. A very strange story. But anyway, that was one of the more interesting trips we took because we found a crashed plane that time and found baby diapers in the plane, stacked, perfect condition. That's the one where we pulled the pilot's bag out. And that's also where the 5 water spouts went by, and all the electricity on the boat shut down during it. And one of the three boats we had, the engine kept going down into the water. Zzz, down into the water on its own. Pull it out. He had to disconnect the battery because the engine wanted to keep going down into the water. Very weird. A lot of weird stuff like that happened.
Do you end up doing a show on the Bermuda Triangle?
I never really did the thing. We did 2. One is with National Geographic. Like I said, it's the best one we ever did. It's I don't remember if it's The Truth About the Bermuda Triangle. I think that's what it is. That one. And we also did Mystery Quest, one on the Bermuda Triangle there, where we had found a lot of planes, and they actually did go out with us to a bunch of planes that we had found. But all those, we didn't do any exploring on any of them. We took them to places we'd already found because they don't have time to explore.
One of the things I find about doing this show is that it would be nice to have guests for 7 or 8 hours because it just leads you so many different places.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of the things I want you to consider, and I realize you're a pretty busy guy, but if you might agree to come back at some point in time and talk about the Bermuda Triangle, that's always been a fascinating topic for me.
It is. A plane disappeared while we were there. We were asked to go out on a plane and look around. A plane went down that had 4 passengers and a pilot and a co-pilot. Never found a trace of it. We were there right after they pulled a plane out of a large, it was a channel they were digging for a water ferry, a giant ferry boat that carried water from Andros to Nassau. And they just pulled a plane nobody even knew was in the water, pulled it out and drug it up and used a tractor to pull it into a jungle. Nothing happens. Nobody looks. There is no investigation of planes down there. There is no U.S. group down there looking. The Bahamians really don't have a Navy. They don't have an Air Force. There's no real way for them to look at anything. They do have a defense force. It's mainly around Nassau, but it's not used for anything but drug trafficking. Yeah.
I've got one final question. I know
Sure.
Dan's the timekeeper. He's looking to wrap it up, and I just want to bring it back to Edgar Cayce in terms of what, if anything, you can kind of summarize what his view was on how humanity should evolve. I guess what we should be doing to become better humans. I guess I'm sure he spoke to that at least in some way. But what should we be doing that we're not doing, I think, is the question.
Edgar had fundamentalist Christian beliefs, and those came through in his readings.
Mm-hmm.
And what he would have said is the golden rule: do unto others what you would have others do to you. That's the fundamental thing. Treat people right.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about being honest. He talked about helping others, that was important. He said we're a piece of God, that all of us we're souls, but we're a piece of God. That's what a soul is. And that it's separated out from God to evolve, to become more than what it was. And the whole purpose of it is to perfect ourselves and return to the source. That's what Edgar Cayce's whole philosophy of spirituality is about. And that's probably the best summary I've ever given of that. We are a piece of God, and we're on our way back. Now, maybe after we get back, God has changed and he decides to do it. It decides to do it all again, and we get blown out again, and we go through it all again in some other way and evolve more. So that's what he said. But his fundamental thing is to treat people correctly. Don't be mean. Kindness is very important in it. Be very tolerant of others. Be tolerant of others because they're on a path, and they may be crossing your path, but they're not where you are. Some of us are more or less advanced, and that's just the way it is, and you have to be accepting of that. So he was very accepting of people. He was very accepting of people that disbelieved him and people that called him a fraud and all that. He was okay with that. He didn't get angry about it. So we're just a piece of God trying to return.
Yeah.
Well, we hope we can get you to return again.
I'll try.
Segue.
All right.
Excellent.
Thanks so much for being on with us, Greg. It's nice to
Greg,
meet you in person and hear about Edgar Cayce and Atlantis.
Thank you.
So Dave once we get this edited, Dave will send you the edited copy, and then you can listen to yourself.
All right. You'll send a link to it, right? So I can post a link.
Right. Dave.
Yeah.
Bingo. Gotcha.
Yeah, a YouTube link.
Okay. I'll post it in the places where I post.
Okay.
My
Thanks,
my 5 listeners will all be there.
Well,
we have 6, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe I can add your 6 to my 5, and now we're up to 12 or 11 or whatever it is.
Rich. We're not in it for the money or the exposure necessarily. We do it because we like to have this conversation.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Every conversation we have, I learn a little bit more, and things get to be a little bit clearer. And you get a lot of corroboration from these topics that seemingly are disconnected or very far apart. And then you realize, no, it's not any different than what we talked about 2 weeks ago. And you can start to put the pieces together, which is satisfying in itself and rewarding. So that's really
my last words will be what Native Americans said about all of it. And this is also in that new book. All things are connected. That is their belief. That is the fundamental shaman's belief. All things are connected. If you can find those connections, you can rattle them. You can wiggle them. You can do things at the connections, and that's what shamans did. And there's a little secret in all that. My first book in all this was called People of the Web. And if you think of a spider's web, if you shake any part of the spider's web, you shake it all. Anything that happens anywhere in the spider's web happens everywhere. So that's the secret of shamans and so on. It's figuring out that it is a web and everything is connected. So that's my ending.
All right. Thanks again, Greg.
Been a pleasure, guys.
Okay. We'll talk to you again.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.